The New South Wales Premier has warned people not to travel to Melbourne amid a growing outbreak. The Prime Minister and Chief Medical Officer argue COVID clusters are to be expected, but one state is using it as a reason to delay restriction relief.
The Prime Minister on board for the first drive-through of Sydney's $3 billion North Connects tunnel, as his Deputy PM talks up the benefits.
If you are in Newcastle and you want to drive to Melbourne, you can get there now without actually having to encounter a set of traffic lights.
But for now, it's a red light from the New South Wales Premier for those considering travelling to certain Melbourne suburbs.
Do not go to those hotspots, reconsider your plans.
And delivering strong travel advice for the Victorian capital in its entirety.
We would recommend people not at this stage travel to Melbourne unless they have to.
But amid growing concerns about a second wave emerging in Victoria, Gladys Berejiklian shut down speculation there could be a border ban.
The border between New South Wales and Victoria will continue to stay open.
And the nation's strategy will continue to stay the course. The Chief Medical Officer says Australia's approach remains suppression rather than elimination of the virus.
And our strategy always envisaged that we'd get some outbreaks, and this outbreak in Victoria did concern us. There's no question about that, the rate of rise and the fact that it was community transmission.
In his first comments on the escalating Victorian situation, the Prime Minister praised localised containment measures but warned states not to use outbreaks as an excuse to delay restriction relief.
And we can't just shut everything up forever. The economic impacts of that are devastating.
Scott Morrison says Melbourne serves as a wake-up call amid concerns of growing complacency.
COVID hasn't gone anywhere. It's still out there and it can still take hold.
And it was a similar message in the nation's capital. Despite no active COVID cases in Canberra, the Territory's Health Minister seizing on the Victorian outbreak, warning restriction relief could be wound back after dozens of businesses were found to breach social distancing rules.
There is a risk that we will have to go backwards and tighten restrictions if we don't all play our part.
But in Western Australia, they're moving forward with restriction relief as Phase 4 begins this Saturday.
Yes, that means from Saturday we can all enjoy a beer standing up at the bar. Many events will now be permitted in WA. For Optus Stadium, we're talking about 30,000 people.
But only West Australians are set to benefit, with Premier Mark McGowan surprising the state by flagging his proposed border opening date was off the agenda.
The current situation in Victoria is dire. The tentative date was going to be on the 8th of August. But right now, it would be irresponsible of me to earmark that date as our potential opening with the rest of the country.
Trudy McIntosh, Sky News, Canberra.
Let's get some more on that story with our political editor, Andrew Clennell. Andrew, very different language, wasn't it, from Premier McGowan to what we heard within the same hour from the Chief Health Officer, Professor Brendan Murphy.
You know, Brendan Murphy and Scott Morrison are trying to calm the horses, and Mark McGowan saying it's dire and justifying it for a decision to have hard borders after August 8. What's really concerning here, Kieran, is we've now got the premiers of South Australia who made comments this afternoon, Steve Marshall, Anastasia Palaszczuk in Queensland, expressing concerns about opening borders on the dates that they were considering, June 29 and July 10 respectively, and Mark McGowan saying he was going to reopen on August 8 and now saying he's not. And this is potentially devastating for the economy. It really is. You know, there's been a lot of work by the federal government behind the scenes, by ministers and the Prime Minister, to get these states to agree to reopen. And on top of that, obviously, we have Gladys Berejiklian saying, don't go to Melbourne. It's a pretty ordinary situation. And, you know, we've seen this situation too, at least question marks raised at the federal level about the impact of protests. The Black Lives Matters protest 2 weeks ago in Melbourne. Now, 16 new cases today. 3 are a contact of one of the 3 protesters at those rallies. So that's a pretty high percentage. Now, it might be a coincidence, but there's certainly concern at the federal level about linkages. Now, you might say, well, there are equally big protests in Sydney and Brisbane, so perhaps not. We haven't seen cases there. But there hasn't been much doubt over the past few weeks that where community transmission is occurring is more in Melbourne than in other places. So there was that vulnerability there. Let's have a listen now to Brendan Murphy address this. He's not tying the cases to the rally, but he's saying that sort of behaviour can encourage other sort of behaviour, which is against the social distancing ethos. And then let's hear Mark McGowan, the WA Premier, basically say, sorry guys, we can't open the border now.
Well, I think a super spreader event you need to have a super spreader there to spread it, and the potential is always there. I think you're probably right that we probably were lucky to have not seen major transmission at any of these events. There were two reasons for us strongly recommending against these events. One was the risk of spreading, but the other is it does send a very difficult message to the rest of the community who are obeying all of the restrictions and the density rules to see people gathering in large numbers in a situation where you can't track who you've been next to. And there is always the potential that people seeing that sort of gathering may have felt less compliant with the regulations in their other aspects of their life. So we still are very strongly discouraging these sort of events.
The current situation in Victoria is dire. It's extremely concerning. The spike in cases there is being closely monitored here. This is why a decision on our hard border will only ever be based on expert health advice. Reimposing restrictions like Victoria's had to is the last thing I ever want to do. That's why I won't undo the good work of all Western Australians and rush to open the border. I had planned to announce a tentative date for the removal of WA's hard border as part of our roadmap today. However, with the situation evolving in Victoria, based on our health advice, we've decided to put that on hold. The tentative date was going to be on the 8th of August, but right now it would be irresponsible of me to earmark that date as our potential opening with the rest of the country.
I'd always heard September was the most likely date for WA to reopen their border, Kieran. I'm certainly hoping I can see my mum for Christmas, to be quite frank with you, but it is an interesting situation that you can't even have a tentative date 2 months away. You won't even put that up there. You know, at least Stephen Marshall in SA is saying, look, if Victoria gets worse, we're not opening, but at this point, we're very hopeful that Victoria will get better. We know contact tracers are coming from New South Wales and South Australia to assist Victorian contact tracing, which should help with the outbreaks. We know they're shutting suburbs down instead of the whole city, but it is, some people have pointed out, it's a fifth of the population in Melbourne. But we also know, there's Optus Stadium, that Mark McGowan's saying we can have 30,000 of the 60,000 there. I mean, that seems a bit of a risk, doesn't it? And particularly when the AHPPC is saying, look, it could be out there in the community in any state, even if there's no cases at the moment. And he's really putting pressure on the AFL here. We know the West Coast Eagles coach Adam Simpson's put pressure on the AFL from round 5 or whenever it is for the hub, as it's called, several teams to come to Perth. But that's effectively opening your hard border, isn't it? 2 Melbourne teams, and we know one Essendon player's tested positive. So I guess that this announcement's putting pressure on the AFL to say you have to have teams here. But at the same time, it seems to be an argument against the hard border. So I think we'll have to watch this with interest. But I must say, Scott Morrison must have real concerns now around these state borders and how these outbreaks in Melbourne can ruin a lot of good work he's done in terms of the road to recovery planning.
Yeah, well, it's certainly scratching my head when the Premier was talking about a crowd of 30,000 and his 2 most popular teams are on the Gold Coast. I'm not sure how that works.